The first thing that caught John's eye was the bridge. It was a Roman masterpiece, sturdy and elegant, spanning the Guadalquivir River. The sun's rays danced on the water, and the bridge stood as a testament to the ancient world's engineering prowess. But as John and his companions crossed, they couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The southern bank of the river, once bustling with life, now lay eerily quiet. Nearly a century earlier, in 818, a rebellion had swept through the area, and the settlement was cleared. The land remained sparsely inhabited, with only a large cemetery, a leper colony, and a few scattered munyas, small, luxurious residences dotting the landscape. One of these munyas, the Madinat Nasser, stood out. Built in the early 9th century by a counselor of the Emir Abd al-Rahman II, it was a place of beauty and history. Later, it became the home of Zuryab, a famous musician and courtier. By the 10th century, it had fallen into the hands of the caliph and was often used to house important visitors, like the envoys from Constantinople in 949. But the real marvel lay a few miles west of Córdoba. In 936, Abd al-Rahman III, the caliph, began building a new palace on a hill above the Guadalquivir Valley. This was no ordinary palace. It was a grand center of government, a symbol of his new dignity as caliph. He had grand visions, inspired by the colossal palace complex of Samarra in Baghdad, and he was determined to create something equally magnificent. The site, called Madinat az-Zahra, required an enormous effort. Thousands of workers toiled to level the ground, and Roman ruins were pilfered for reusable masonry. Marble was imported from North Africa, and a Christian bishop, Ricemond of Elvira, was sent to the Byzantine Empire to collect works of art and craftsmen. The palace's throne rooms, especially the Hall of the Caliphs, were breathtaking. The walls and roof were made of translucent marble, and in the center stood a large bowl of mercury. When the caliph wished to impress, a slave would rock the bowl, and the sunbeams reflecting off the mercury would create a dazzling display of light, like lightning dancing through the room. The palace was more than just a place of grandeur. It was a city in itself. Government offices, mosques, markets, and residential areas sprang up around it. The road between Córdoba and Madinat az-Zahra became a ribbon of development, dotted with homes and businesses. In 953, John of Gors, an abbot from the monastery of Gors in Lorraine, arrived in Córdoba on a mission from Otto I of Germany. His task was to seek the caliph's help in suppressing piracy in the western Mediterranean. However, the letters he carried were hostile to Islam, and the caliph refused to receive him. John and his companions were kept in a state of semi-captivity for nearly 3 years, their frustration growing with each passing day. Finally, in 956, the situation changed. A Jewish leader named Hasdai ibn Shaprat and a Christian bishop, John of Córdoba, intervened. They sent Ricemond to the German court to request more diplomatic letters. When Ricemond returned with the appropriate letters, John was finally allowed to present himself to the caliph. The day of the audience was a spectacle. The road to the palace was lined with soldiers, and the air was thick with dust. John and his companions were met by high officials and led through a sea of people to the palace gates. As they entered, they were greeted by carpets of the finest quality, and the palace itself was a wonder of opulence. The caliph, reclining on a richly ornate couch, extended his hand to be kissed, a gesture of respect, usually reserved for the most important visitors. John, dressed in his simple monk's habit, refused to change into more elaborate clothing, even when offered money by the caliph. His unyielding firmness impressed the caliph, who remarked, "Even if he comes dressed in a sack, I will most gladly receive him." As John approached the dais, the caliph's court was a display of power and wealth. The floors were tiled with rare stones, and the air was filled with the scent of incense. The caliph himself, almost like a god, sat alone, surrounded by the splendor of his kingdom. John, a simple monk from the north, was about to enter a world of unimaginable luxury and grandeur. Their meeting was a moment of cultural and political significance, a testament to the complex and vibrant world of 10th century Córdoba. The caliph's court was a center of learning, art, and diplomacy, a place where the best and brightest from across the known world came to share their knowledge and seek the caliph's favor. John's encounter was just one of many that would shape the history of Al-Andalus and its connections to the wider world. The caliph stretched out his hand, and John, with a deep bow, kissed it, the audience had begun. In the world of the caliphs, where science and learning flourished, the work of people like Maslama al-Madjriti, a renowned astronomer from Madrid, stands out. Born around 950, Maslama was drawn to the intellectual center of Córdoba, where he joined the vibrant circles of scholars supported by the caliph. His most famous achievement was updating the astronomical tables of al-Madjriti to match the meridian of Córdoba, based on observations he made in 979. He also translated Ptolemy's planisphere into Arabic, showing how Greek science was embraced in Spain at that time. Maslama wrote a textbook on commercial arithmetic, which was probably very useful for the merchants and traders of Al-Andalus. He also wrote a guide on how to use an astrolabe, a tool that was essential for navigation and astronomy. Maslama was a respected teacher, and many of his students went on to become famous in their own right. Some even say he was the official astrologer of the caliph, predicting the political turmoil that followed his death in 1007. While Maslama was a star in the scientific world, there were many other skilled professionals who contributed to the rich culture of Al-Andalus. One such family was the Banu Zuhr, a dynasty of physicians. The first in the family to practice medicine was Muhammad ibn Marwan ibn Zuhr, who lived in Seville from 947 to 1032. His son, Abd al-Malik, traveled to the east to study and later became a doctor in Dinaya, a city on the Mediterranean coast. Abd al-Malik's son, Zuhr, returned to Seville and became the chief physician for the ruling family. His son, also named Abd al-Malik, was the court doctor for the Almohad caliphs and wrote several medical books. The great-great-grandson, Muhammad, who died around 1200, was known not only as a doctor but also as a poet. His self-composed epitaph is a moving reflection on life and death. You stopping here, please contemplate. Look at the place to which I now have been brought. The grave's earth covers my face, as if I never had trodden it before. I used to save men from the fear of death. Now I've become the hostage of death myself. The Banu Zuhr family's success over generations shows how the peaceful and prosperous years under the caliphs of the 10th century allowed many skilled and professional families to flourish. However, it would be wrong to think that Al-Andalus was always a place of harmony. After the death of Caliph al-Hakam II in 976, tensions began to rise. One of the key figures in this period was al-Madjriti, whose full name was Abu Amir Muhammad ibn Abi Amir al-Mafari. He was born in 938 into a family of Arab descent near Algeciras. Al-Madjriti received a good education in Córdoba, and his talent and ambition soon caught the attention of important people. He rose through the ranks and became a key figure in the court. When al-Hakam II died, his young son Hisham II, only 11 years old, was made caliph. A regency was formed to govern in his name, consisting of al-Mashafi, the first minister, Ghalib, the leading military general, and al-Madjriti. These three men represented different tensions in Al-Andalus. Ghalib, a military man from the northern frontier, and al-Madjriti, a civil servant, symbolized the tension between the military and the civil. Al-Mashafi, a Berber from Valencia, was seen as an upstart and was widely disliked. Al-Madjriti used his Arab descent to his advantage, claiming that his family had fought in the original invasion of Spain in 711. Al-Madjriti managed to outmaneuver his rivals. He had al-Mashafi disgraced, imprisoned, and eventually killed. He also defeated Ghalib in battle in 981. During this time, al-Madjriti gained popularity by leading a successful campaign against the Kingdom of Leon in 977. He also built a new palace, al-Madinat al-Zahra, to rival the caliph's complex, Madinat az-Zahra. By 981, al-Madjriti was the de facto ruler of Al-Andalus. He continued to lead campaigns against the Christian kingdoms, attacking places like Barcelona, Coimbra, and Santiago de Compostela. His most famous raid was the sack of Santiago in 997. These campaigns were not just about religion. They were about wealth, tribute, and power. Al-Madjriti even used Christian mercenaries in his army, showing that his motives were more practical than religious. Al-Madjriti's rule was also marked by lavish building projects and the expansion of the army. He brought in thousands of Berber soldiers, which created new tensions. These Berbers were often seen as second-class citizens, and were resented by the Arab population. The Berbers remained loyal to al-Mansur and his son, Abd al-Malik, rather than to the caliph. The Caliphate of Córdoba, which had been a symbol of authority for half a century, was weakened by al-Mansur's actions. The Caliph Hisham II was a figurehead with no real power. When al-Mansur died in 1002, his son continued his policies, raiding Christian territories until his own death in 1008. The legacy of al-Mansur and his son was a powerful but deeply divided Al-Andalus, where the seeds of future conflict had already been sown. The early years of the 11th century in Al-Andalus were a time of turmoil and crisis. For nearly a century, Al-Andalus had been a powerhouse rich, well-governed, powerful, and renowned. But by the year 1008, everything began to fall apart. The end of the Umayyad dynasty's golden age came with a series of dramatic events. After the death of Abd al-Malik, a great-grandson of Abd al-Rahman III, named Muhammad II, seized power and declared himself caliph. He even destroyed the magnificent palace of al-Madinat al-Zahra, which had been a symbol of Umayyad glory. However, his reign was short-lived. A rival caliph, Suleiman, emerged with the support of Berber generals. Suleiman called for help from the Christian Count of Castile, Sancho Garcia, and together they defeated Muhammad II in 1009. Suleiman was then proclaimed caliph, but his triumph was brief. Muhammad II fled to Toledo and sought help from the Christian north. The Counts of Barcelona and Urgel responded and defeated Suleiman and his Berber allies in 1010. This year became known as the Year of the Catalans among Andalusi chroniclers. Muhammad II briefly reclaimed the throne, but was assassinated in July. Hisham II, who had been deposed earlier, was restored as caliph by his followers. However, Suleiman returned and besieged Córdoba for 2.5 years. During the siege, the Berbers wreaked havoc in the southeastern parts of Spain, living off the land and extorting protection money from cities. The situation in Córdoba became dire. The city was overcrowded with refugees, and a wet spring in 1011 caused serious flooding. An outbreak of plague added to the misery. The government was so broke that it had to sell off parts of al-Hakam II's library. In 1013, Córdoba surrendered to Suleiman, and the Berbers sacked the city, killing many citizens and dispersing the remaining caliphal library. Suleiman's rule was chaotic. His Berber followers treated Córdoba like an occupied city, killing and looting at will. They demanded fiefs and governorships, and Suleiman, powerless, had to comply. In 1016, one of the generals overthrew and executed Suleiman. The Caliphate of Córdoba continued to decline, with short-lived puppet caliphs coming and going. The last caliph, Hisham III, was expelled from Córdoba in 1031, marking the end of the Caliphate. The fall of the Caliphate marked the beginning of a new era. The once unified Al-Andalus fragmented into smaller regional states, known as Taifa states. These were ruled by emirs, or Taifa kings. The term Taifa means party or faction, and it suggests a somewhat whimsical and relaxed atmosphere, which was far from the reality of the birth of these states. One of the most notable Taifa states was Granada. The Berber general Zawi ibn Ziri was granted authority over the province of Elvira by the Caliph Suleiman around 1014. Elvira, a city in the fertile Vega at the foot of the Sierra Nevada, had suffered greatly during the fitna. According to a later account, the people of Elvira wrote to Zawi, asking him to protect them. They promised to share their lives and possessions in exchange for his protection. However, this story seems more like a myth to legitimize Zawi's rule. It's more likely that Zawi seized power and got the caliph to recognize it. Zawi's first act was to move the capital from Elvira to a new, more defensible site in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. This was the birth of the city of Granada. Similar events played out in other parts of Al-Andalus. In places like Algeciras, Arcos de la Frontera, Carmona, Malaga, Murtola, Moron, and Ronda, Berber generals seized power. Across the straits at Ceuta, the same pattern emerged. In some regions, local notables who had already been exercising power as deputies of the caliphate continued to rule. For example, the Banu Zuhr dynasty ruled Albarracin from 1012 to 1104. In other areas, civil administrators who had risen to prominence under al-Mansur and his son took control. These administrators were often of slave or freedman origin, and some were not even from the Iberian Peninsula. For instance, Sabr al-Saklabi, a man of Persian origin, became the emir of Badajoz. He had been a slave and civil governor under al-Hakam II, and continued to rule the region after the fall of the caliphate. One of the most interesting Taifa states was Dinaya, on the Mediterranean coast. Mujahid al-Amiri, a man of slave origin, took control of Dinaya and turned it into a corsair state. He launched a fleet of 125 ships to conquer Sardinia in 1015. Although he was initially successful, the combined forces of Genoa and Pisa drove him out the following year. Despite his piratical activities, Mujahid was also a patron of religious scholarship and supported the study of the Quran. He ruled Dinaya until his death in 1044, when his son Ali succeeded him. The Taifa states, born from the chaos of the Fitna, marked a new chapter in the history of Al-Andalus. The era of the caliphate was over, and these small, independent states would shape the region for the next few decades. In the early 11th century, the once mighty caliphate of Córdoba fragmented into smaller, independent states known as taifas. These states, or party kingdoms, were often fragile and short-lived, with rulers constantly facing challenges to their authority. The rulers of these taifas came from various backgrounds. Some were former military leaders, others were civil servants, and a few were even former slaves. Despite their different origins, all of them struggled to maintain power in a landscape of intense political and military competition. One of the most notable examples of this instability occurred in Badajoz. The city was initially ruled by the sons of Sabr al-Saklabi, but they were soon displaced by their chief minister, Ibn al-Aftaz, who established the Aftacid dynasty. In Valencia, the bureaucrats who initially took control in 1010 were eventually replaced by a grandson of al-Zuhr, a powerful military leader from the previous century. Similarly, in Zaragoza, the Tujibid family, which had been in power since the early 10th century, was overthrown by the Hudids in 1039. The internal politics of these taifas were incredibly complex. Rulers were surrounded by relatives, many of whom had their own claims to power and were ready to challenge the current leader. This created a constant state of tension and often led to internal conflicts. Neighboring rulers were always looking for opportunities to expand their territories, and they were often willing to support rebellious relatives or claimants in exchange for their own gains. This political instability meant that the Taifa rulers were always on the defensive. They had to be skilled in both diplomacy and warfare to survive. The lack of established frontiers and the absence of sophisticated means to resolve disputes made force and the threat of force the primary tools of governance. The models they followed were often those of the powerful caliphs and military leaders from the previous century, who had built their reputations on constant military campaigns against their neighbors. As the years passed, some taifas grew stronger while others weakened. By the middle of the 11th century, a few prominent taifas had emerged: Seville and Granada in the south, Badajoz, Toledo, and Valencia in the center, and Zaragoza in the northeast. These larger states continued to expand, absorbing smaller taifas and consolidating their power. Seville, in particular, became a major force under the rule of the Abbadid family. Muhammad ibn Ismail ibn Abbad, the founder of the Abbadid dynasty, was a powerful local figure in Seville. He was a wealthy landowner, controlling a significant portion of the city's agricultural land and trade, and he also held the position of Cadi, or chief judge. His son, al-Mu'tadid, and his grandson, al-Mu'tamid, continued to expand Seville's influence. Al-Mu'tadid was a skilled military leader and a gifted poet, and he used both his military prowess and his cultural patronage to strengthen his rule. He conquered several neighboring taifas, including Murtola, Huelva, and Córdoba, and his son al-Mu'tamid continued this expansion, even capturing Murcia in 1078. Seville's wealth and prosperity were built on its rich agricultural lands and vibrant trade. The city was known for its olive oil, which was highly prized throughout the Mediterranean, and its plantations of sugarcane and ranches. The Guadalquivir River, which had been a major trade route for centuries, continued to bring in valuable goods, including luxury items like musical instruments and specialized tiles. Seville's cultural life flourished under the Abbadids, who patronized the arts and attracted poets, scholars, and craftsmen to their court. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Taifa period was the reactivation of creative energies in the provinces. With the decline of the centralized caliphate, artists and scholars who had previously been drawn to Córdoba began to thrive in other cities. For example, in Cuenca, a city about 100 miles east of Toledo, a school of ivory carvers emerged. These skilled artists produced exquisite caskets and other items, often commissioned by the ruling family of Toledo. The Cuenca school is a prime example of how princely patronage in the Taifas led to a renaissance in the arts. The rulers of the Taifas were not only warriors, but also patrons of learning and culture. Many of them were highly educated and cultivated men. Al-Mu'tadid and al-Mu'tamid of Seville were both renowned poets, and their works reflect the cultural sophistication of their court. Al-Mu'tadid's poetry celebrated his victories and his love for his family, while al-Mu'tamid's verses often spoke of the beauty of the natural world and the joys of love. Their patronage of the arts and their own literary talents helped to make Seville a center of cultural excellence during the 11th century. The Taifa period was a time of both conflict and creativity. The constant struggles for power and the fragility of the political landscape meant that the rulers had to be constantly vigilant. However, this period also saw a remarkable flowering of the arts and sciences, as the rulers of these small states sought to establish their own legacies and leave a lasting mark on the history of Al-Andalus. The Abbasid court at Seville was a world of its own, a place where extravagance and refinement ruled. One story that captures this spirit involves a favorite wife of al-Mu'tamid, the Abbasid ruler. She was a Christian girl from the north and missed the winter snows. To comfort her, al-Mu'tamid ordered his gardeners to plant a forest of almond trees in bloom outside her palace window. When she woke up, she saw a sea of white flowers that reminded her of snow. It was a beautiful gesture, but also a story that could have happened in many other courts, showing how such tales of love and indulgence were common in the courts of Al-Andalus. Poets were drawn to Seville by the Abbasid court's patronage. One of these was Ibn Hamdi's, a poet from Sicily who fled to Seville after the Normans conquered his homeland. Al-Mu'tamid tested Ibn Hamdi's skills by improvising lines of poetry about a glassworker's furnace, and Ibn Hamdi's responded with such skill that he was hired on a generous salary. His poems often celebrated the pleasures of life, like this one about a party where wine was floated along a stream to the guest. I remember a certain brook that offered the impiety of drunkenness to the topers sitting along its course, with its cups of golden wine. Each silver cup in it filled as though it contained the soul of the sun in the body of the full moon. Whenever a glass reached anyone in our company of topers, he would grasp it gingerly with his 10 fingers. Then he drinks out of it, a grape-induced intoxication, which lulls his very senses without his realizing it. He sends the glass back in the water, thus returning it to the hands of a cupbearer at whose will it had floated to him. Because of the wine-bibbing, we imagined our song to be melodies which the birds sang without verse, and which offered us delights of all kinds, while the only reward of the cupbearer was that we offered him to the ocean to drink. For life is excusable only when we walk along the shores of pleasure and abandon all restraint. But not all the scholars of this time were part of the courtly life. Ibn Hazm, born in Córdoba, was a unique figure. He started his career in politics, but later retreated to his family estates to focus on his studies. Despite his isolation, he produced many important works, including The Ring of the Dove, a treatise on love that is celebrated for its psychological insight, and The Book of Sects, a detailed examination of different religious beliefs. Ibn Hazm was critical of the Abbasid dynasty and often found himself in trouble, but his works remain influential. The Christian communities in Al-Andalus, known as Mozarabs, lived in a complex relationship with the Muslim rulers. They were tolerated but often faced restriction. Some lived in separate quarters, while others were more integrated. They traded with Muslims, worked alongside them, and sometimes even interacted in ways that were frowned upon, like Muslims visiting Christian monasteries for wine. Despite these interactions, there was a significant cultural divide. Christians generally preferred to keep a low profile and focused on maintaining their faith, while Muslims often saw Christians through a lens of stereotype. Jews, on the other hand, were more integrated into urban life. They were prosperous and involved in trade across the Mediterranean. One of the most prominent figures was Samuel ibn Nagrilla, who rose to become the first minister of Granada. He was a skilled politician, a respected rabbi, and a talented poet. His life and works reflect the diverse and dynamic society of Al-Andalus. In the end, the world of Al-Andalus was a tapestry of cultures and beliefs, where luxury and learning flourished, but also where tensions and stereotypes sometimes prevailed. It was a time of great creativity and complexity, a period that left a lasting legacy in the fields of literature, science, and culture.